Distinguished academia, Board of Governors, Board of Directors, ladies and gentlemen. I am frequently dubbed as a classicist. I do not mind this, even though I know that the implication is that I belong to a breed conservative in nature, thoroughly insensitive to all modern endeavors, and blind to the world of computer. It speaks volumes for the anti-intellect culture which is spreading all around us, that classics and classicism are now considered to be disparaging words, and classicism is antiquated and old-fashioned, appreciated only by old fogies like myself. The loss of intellect is one of the most damaging aspects of our existence today. Intellect and intellectual have become disparaging words. We seem to regard intellectuals as highfalutin, impractical people. When we discard classicism, we also discard not only the heritage of our own sources of inspiration, because we think that in this changing world of ours, we must not hark back to the past. What is classicism? What is classics? If I were to be flippant, I would quote Alan Bennett and say, classics is a book that everyone is supposed to have read, and which they often think that they have read it themselves. Seriously though, classics is not a 3-year highly scholastic course in Latin and Greek at Oxford or Cambridge. Dictionaries would tell you that it pertains to Greek art and literature, Greek and Latin art and literature. Mercifully, the concise Oxford tells us that it can be outstandingly important. I would like to submit to you that any creative work of the past, be it sculpture or poetry, drama, or architecture, which stimulates the depth of our imagination, is classic. And so, I think the Parthenon and the stupas of Sanchi are classic, and Milton's Paradise Lost is classic, and the poetry of Ghalib is classic, because classics is not the sole prerogative of the West. Some people who have read my book, The God of My Idolatry, gain the impression that I was brought up on Shakespeare. This is far from true. My father, after retirement, sometimes used to take me along on his evening walks. We would walk on dusty tracks which stretched for miles beyond our solitary house in Model Town in Lahore. And then suddenly, flicking a leaf or a stone with his walking stick, my father would intone, "Oh, what a rogue am I." Why he omitted "and peasant slave am I don't know. But I went along everywhere, merrily declaiming, "Oh, what a rogue am I," always imagining a rogue to be an old man with a walking stick. You could say that this was my first tentative introduction to Shakespeare. Other than I have bedimmed the noontide sun, which he tossed at my mother when he was in one of his jovial moods, my father was not in the habit of quoting Shakespeare at home. My mother, who knew no English, would cover up her face with her veil and giggle silently. I always thought it was a joke. It was not until I got enrolled at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art in London that I realized that it was not a joke, but a quote from Shakespeare's Tempest. Now, I got hooked on Shakespeare when I first saw Richard Burton's Hamlet at the Old Vic, way back in the early 50s. Was it his voice that mesmerized me? Or was it the energy that he exuded? I don't know. But he created magic. And I remember making a vow to myself that I must get a better acquaintanceship with Shakespeare. Shakespeare is a wonderful example of classicism. Well, Renaissance classicism, if you like. The Greek myths are one of the most common ways that classics first come to our notice. These tales had been recounted throughout the ancient literature, not only in Greek tragedy, but also in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. These tales also had an implication when the Romans told these tales. When we talk about Midas's golden touch, or when we talk about Epicure, or when we talk about why Eurydice was salvaged, we then think that all these references have been told in excellent epics and drama and poetry. A great deal of theorizing has gone into the accounting for these myths, especially in the 20th century. The story of Oedipus gave Freud a lifeline. He announced to the world that the working of human psyche was largely rooted in the incest of Oedipus with his mother after he killed his own father. He gave us the term Oedipus complex, and a substantial part of the world has since looked upon all familial engagements and estrangements only in the light of the Freudian mantra. Bacchus and Epicure and their interpretations have proliferated throughout the world. Our experience of classics is variably influenced by those who have gone before us. We experience classics in the light of what previous generations have said and thought and written about the ancient world. Part of the contemporary appeal of classics is the way in which ancient writers confronted traditions of their own world. In their works, we get to know what we now call multiculturalism of their own societies. Classics do not simply enlighten us. They also jolt us out of our erroneous perceptions of certain epochs. A splendid example is that of Sultan Muhammad Tughlaq, who ruled India for 26 years, 700 years ago. And we read in our textbooks that Tughlaq was a most accomplished calligrapher, well-versed in Persian poetry, who also had a thorough knowledge of mathematics, logic, physics, and Greek philosophy. But when we turn to Ibn Battuta, part of our own classics, whose antecedents as a historian are as valid as Herodotus, we discover that contrasting with all these brilliant qualities, there was a dark side to him which made him into a terrible tyrant and incomprehensible. Classicism does not give birth to culture. It is the other way round. Our culture is a forbidding word, but I know of none better to describe the beautiful words and marvelous objects which men have created and have handed down to us, and which some of us hope to hand on. In the last 75 years, there have been a great deal of argumentations about culture in our country. Is culture the outcome of a whole way of life? Or is it simply the selected highlights of a society's most intellectually and artistically enlightened citizens? Is it the best of a civilization? Or is it a conglomeration of disparate antagonistic forces which reflect disintegration and divisiveness of a society at a given period, like the one we are living in right now? In our part of the world, no two people can ever agree on the definition of culture. Does culture generate sensibility and taste? I doubt it. It is true that when culture becomes a mode of perception, concepts like sensibility and taste evolve. But in countries like ours, dominated by ideological and demagogic concerns rather than cultural concerns, individuals alone worry about matters like taste. In our society, the taste that we profess publicly is more often than not in conflict with what we cherish in our privacy. Let me illustrate. We don't really mind if some of our misguided young men become involved in the learning of music, but we take an exception if our young women show such leanings. True, some middle and upper middle class people, girls, show an interest in the learning of music, and their parents, grudgingly or willingly, employ male tutors to visit their homes, but they do so only to indulge their daughters' fondness for music. Music is not something that a girl from a respectable, quote-unquote, family is allowed to pursue professionally. The fact that the condition of being a male or female determines the form of culture we are allowed to imbibe. The problem lies with the word professional. It has been embedded into our psyche that the profession of music and dance belongs to a different breed of people, a breed with whom the decent folk, quote unquote, have no truck. We deplore publicly female dancing on stage, but we drool privately when we see mujras in the drawing rooms of the so-called upper classes. Seminars on culture are fussy, time-wasting procedures. We shall never resolve anything unless we understand that what constitutes our culture includes a relish of pursuits that become forbidden from time to time. We refuse to accept that our culture has also been culled out of the multi-civilizational ethos of South Asia. If this leads to a kind of hypocrisy, then that too is a part of our cultural makeup. No matter what the strictures, we shall always derive a thrill out of atavism. In the dark decade of the 1980s, the official seminars on our social behavior were all about rooting out the insidious foreign elements which it was believed had crept into our so-called culture. The dictator who ruled us for 10 years and his jingoistic accomplices felt that the slightest whiff from across the border would shatter our faith and annihilate our ideology. Such bigotry is again rising its head. In my own work, ladies and gentlemen, I undertake to transcend my own inadequacies, my work being interpretations and projections of other people's thoughts. I keep making forays into the past You could say that it is a monument to the past, but a monument suggests a gravestone, cold and immutable. I like to think that my work reflects the play of sunlight and rain. I hope that my work enables them to stray into a past that was not mute but vibrant. The past is not all repression and internecine struggle and subdued status of women. The past, for me, is beautiful gardens laid out in symmetry. The past, for me, is exceedingly refined musical soirees. I do not mean to imply that I regard modernism to be destructive of the old traditional culture. The old traditional culture was full of cruelties and injustices, but it was a pattern of life known and understood, and therefore more acceptable than the hodgepodge mannerism that we call our urban culture. Our cultural outlets are limited. In most of the cities, a large number of people go out in the evening in search of cuisine and not culture. A new phenomenon is a steady growth of guitar-based bands which sing local songs in the mode of Western pop music. And they do draw a fairly large audience of youngsters. We also have a so-called classical music concert every year. I say so-called because most of the audience goes on chattering and munching, walking in and out of a concert. To draw their attention, the musicians begin to cheapen their performance. Even some of the maestros, hungry for applause, resort to a display of technical dexterity. Tihaiyon pe tihaiyan, tihaiyon pe tihaiyan, tore pe tora, tore pe tora. The crowd is thrilled and claps and whistles unendingly as though they were at a pop concert. For a sensitive listener, it is agonizing. Language, the way it is manipulated and articulated, invigorates me. I have always put a great deal of emphasis on the way a language is spoken. Perhaps it is because of my training as an actor, but diction has a great importance for me because I think clear and proper speech, no matter what the language, is extremely necessary because it also means clarity of thought in some way. I am an avid reader. What do I read? I read books. Books are to me pure magic, festive, curious, and full of other lives and voices and quiet existences raised to the point of exuberance and excitement. Books portray and unearth characters who are perfectly ordinary to begin with and become extraordinary. Books reveal to me the world as it is and sometimes as it ought to be. I pity those who are getting into the habit of reading a book on a computer. They do not know the pleasure you receive of severing and savoring the typeface and the solid binding and the feel of well-made paper. When you read a book, there's no danger of seeing green pixels against a black background, and you do not hear and see or mushrooms tumbling out of the upper margins of the screen. Books are the only testament of humanity to human beings. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now living in a devastatingly tortuous period. I can offer you no words of wisdom that can mitigate the angst and the anguish we are surrounded in. I can only hold on to my own belief that work is life, and there's no point to life other than work. I thank you for your patience.